The air in the Plaza of Mani is thick with a specific pungent smoke. It is July 12th, 1562. In the center of the village, a Franciscan friar stands before a massive pyre. Around him, the ground is littered with thousands of objects: idols carved from jade, peculiar round calendars, and, most tragically, huge piles of books made from folding bark. As the torch touches the dry fig bark paper, the sound is distinct. It is not the crackle of wood, but the hiss of dissolving history. The black ink bubbles. The complex astronomical charts, calculated over 1,000 years, turn to gray ash in seconds. The Mayan elders watch in a silence that is louder than a scream. This was not merely a book burning, it was a lobotomy performed on an entire civilization. Tonight, we investigate the ashes to answer one question. Was Diego de Landa a holy man saving souls from the devil, or was he the greatest criminal in the history of human thought? To understand why the burning was a crime, we first have to understand what was lost. When Europeans looked at the Maya, they saw savages living in the jungle. They were wrong. They were looking at the most advanced mathematicians on the planet. While Europe was struggling through the Dark Ages, trying to remember how to build arches, the Maya were deep in the rainforests of the Yucatan, calculating the movement of the stars with an accuracy that rivals modern NASA computers. They were a civilization obsessed not with gold, not with land, but with time. The Maya had a weapon that the Romans and Greeks never had: the number 0. It seems simple to us, but 0 is a dangerous idea. It allows you to calculate numbers that are infinitely large and infinitely small. Using this, Mayan scribes created calendars that didn't just track the harvest, they tracked the universe. They knew the exact length of a solar year, 365.242 days. They knew the cycle of Venus, 584 days. They tracked the moon, the eclipses, and the wandering stars. This data wasn't just memorized, it was recorded. Mayan cities were filled with libraries. The books, called codices, were beautiful and fragile things. They were made from the inner bark of the wild fig tree, amate. The bark was pounded into long sheets, coated with a layer of white lime plaster, like a fresco wall, and then folded back and forth like a screen. A single book could be 10 feet long when unfolded. Inside, scribes painted thousands of tiny glyphs in black and red ink. These weren't just words, they were art. A page might contain a table of eclipses for the next 500 years. Another might contain the medical cure for a snakebite. Another might hold the genealogy of a king dating back to the mythical creation of the world. The library was the brain of the city. The priests, the kin, the keepers of the days, would consult these books for everything: when to plant corn, when to go to war, when to name a child. We often think of the Maya as a mysterious, silent people, but they were loud. They wrote on everything. They wrote on stone stele, on jade jewelry, on ceramic cups, and on thousands of paper books. When Diego de Landa arrived, he didn't find a primitive tribe. He found a civilization that had been writing down its history for 2,000 years. And in his eyes, that was the problem. Because they weren't writing about Jesus, they were writing about the sky monsters and the rain god, Chalk. He didn't see a library. He saw a manual for devil worship. It is easy to paint Diego de Landa as a cartoon villain, a madman with a torch. But the truth is far more complicated and far more terrifying. De Landa was not a conquistador looking for gold. He was a Franciscan friar who arrived in the Yucatan in 1549 with a genuine desire to help the Maya people. When he first arrived, the Spanish soldiers were treating the Maya like cattle. They were enslaving them, torturing them, and working them to death in the mines. Landa was furious. He wrote angry letters to the King of Spain, demanding that the soldiers stop their brutality. He preached against the greed of his own countrymen. For the first decade, the Maya saw him as a protector. He walked barefoot among them, learned their language perfectly, and ate their food. He was charismatic, intelligent, and driven by a fierce moral code. But Landa's love had a condition: total obedience to God. To Landa, the world was a battlefield between God and Satan. There was no middle ground. The Maya's ancient religion, with its many gods, its strange rituals, and its deep connection to the cosmos, was not just a cultural difference to him. It was an active infection of the devil. He believed that if a Maya person was baptized but still secretly prayed to their old gods, their soul was in mortal danger of burning in hell forever. In his mind, he wasn't destroying their culture. He was performing emergency surgery to save their eternal souls. He was a man willing to do terrible things for what he believed was a righteous cause. For 12 years, Diego de Landa believed he was building the kingdom of heaven in the jungle. He looked at the Maya nobles and saw devout Catholics. They attended Mass, they sang the hymns, and they baptized their children. But in May 1562, that illusion shattered. It started with a rumor. 2 Mayan schoolboys, terrified of a punishment, whispered a secret to a monk. They said that if you followed the village elders into the forest at night, you wouldn't find Jesus, you would find the old caves. Landa immediately ordered an investigation. He sent soldiers into the deep cenotes, the underground sinkholes that the Maya believed were gateways to the underworld, Xibalba. What they found down there broke Landa's heart before it broke his mind. Inside the damp caves, hidden behind stalactites, were altars. But they weren't just pagan altars, they were a horrific hybrid. The soldiers found statues of the Virgin Mary, but when they lifted them up, they found small jade idols of Mayan gods hidden inside the hollow bases. They found crosses draped in snakeskins. The Maya hadn't stopped worshiping their gods, they had simply invited Jesus to join the pantheon. To the Maya, this was adaptation. To Landa, it was the ultimate betrayal. The devil was literally hiding inside the church. Landa's reaction was volcanic. He declared an emergency inquisition. He wasn't just a priest anymore. He became the judge, jury, and executioner. He set up a makeshift tribunal in the town of Mani. He didn't just ask questions, he demanded confessions. And when the Maya nobles refused to speak, he introduced them to the tools of the Spanish dungeon. The primary method was the garrucha, the hoist. The victims' hands were tied behind their back, and they were lifted off the ground by their wrists using a pulley. Weights were tied to their feet. The pain was excruciating. Shoulders would dislocate, muscles would tear. If you think this was just a few bad apples being punished, look at the numbers. The historical records from the tribunal are terrifying in their precision. 4,500 Mayan men and women were arrested and tortured in just 3 months. 158 people died directly on the torture rack before they could even be sentenced. Thousands more were permanently maimed, losing the use of their arms or legs. 27 distinct Mayan lords, the keepers of history, were publicly humiliated and stripped of their rank. The goal wasn't just pain, it was data extraction. Landa wanted to know where the idols were. He wanted to know where the books were. Every scream on the hoist led to another cave, another altar, and another pile of evidence growing in the Plaza of Mani. On July 12, 1562, the torture stopped and the theater began. Diego de Landa ordered a grand auto da fe, an act of faith. This was not a riot, it was a carefully choreographed ceremony designed to humiliate the Mayan soul. The Plaza of Mani was packed. Spanish soldiers in polished armor stood in a ring, their pikes forming a steel fence. Inside the ring were the Mayan lords, the proudest men in the Yucatan, now stripped to their waist, ropes around their necks, wearing yellow San Benito hats, the mark of the penitent heretic. They were forced to kneel in the dirt while Landa ascended the pulpit. He didn't scream, he preached. He spoke of love, forgiveness, and the cleansing power of fire. Then the order was given. Soldiers began to haul the evidence toward the pyre. It was a museum of a civilization being dragged into the trash. 5,000 idols of distinct shapes and sizes, 13 massive stone altars, 22 small stones of strange workmanship, and then the most precious items of all, 27 great rolls of signs and hieroglyphs. To the Spanish soldiers, these books were just lies of the devil, but to the weeping men in the yellow hats, those rolls were their parents, their history, and their future. They contained the records of kings who ruled before Rome fell. They contained the calculations of eclipses that wouldn't happen for another 1,000 years. Landa lit the fire himself. The historical accounts describe the sound. Bark paper is thick and treated with lime stucco. It doesn't burn like modern paper. It pops and cracks like bone. As the flames rose, the crowd of Maya let out a collective sound of anguish, a wailing that unnerved even the Spanish guards. They weren't just watching objects burn, they were watching their collective memory evaporate. Landa stood motionless, watching the smoke rise. In his own journals, he would later write a sentence that is chilling in its casual cruelty. We found a large number of books in these characters, and as they contained nothing in which were not to be seen as superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all, which they regretted to an amazing degree, and which caused them much affliction. Much affliction. That was how he described the erasure of 1,000 years of science. By the time the sun set, the fire had died down to a glowing heap of red embers. The wind picked up the gray ash and scattered the history of the Maya into the jungle, lost forever. Diego de Landa stood over the ashes in Mani and believed he had won. He wrote to the King of Spain that he had cleansed the land of all evil books. He was wrong. Out of the thousands of books that existed in the Yucatan, 4 managed to escape the flames. They didn't survive because of a heroic rescue mission by Mayan warriors. They survived because of something far more mundane: curiosity. It is one of history's great ironies. The same Spanish soldiers who were throwing books into the fire likely slipped a few into their backpacks as souvenirs. To them, these weren't holy texts, they were exotic trinkets, strange folded paper covered in monsters, something to show their families back in Seville or to sell to a collector in Madrid. So, while the library of the Maya turned to smoke in Mexico, 4 silent survivors boarded wooden galleons and crossed the Atlantic Ocean. They sat in the dark holds of ships, surviving storms and pirates, only to land in a Europe that had no idea what they were. The most important survivor is known as the Dresden Codex. For nearly 200 years, it lay forgotten in a private collection in Vienna. Nobody knew what it was. In 1739, the Royal Library of Dresden, Germany, bought it as a Mexican curiosity. It sat on a shelf, unread, until the 19th century. When scholars finally looked at it, they realized they weren't holding a picture book. They were holding a supercomputer made of bark. The Dresden Codex contains the most accurate astronomical tables of the ancient world. It tracks the cycle of Venus with an error of only 0.08 days over a period of 481 years. It predicts solar eclipses with terrifying precision. It is the finest example of Mayan science in existence, and it survived only by blind luck. The other survivors had even closer calls. The Paris Codex was found in 1859 in a dusty chimney corner of the National Library in Paris. It was wrapped in torn paper, covered in soot, and was likely moments away from being thrown into the trash. It deals with the Mayan zodiac and the death of kings. The Madrid Codex was found in two separate pieces. One half was discovered in a pile of papers that were about to be used as cannon wadding or wrapping paper. It is a book of horoscopes and prophecy, miraculously reunited after being ripped in half by a careless owner. Then there is the fourth, the Grolier Codex. Found in a cave in the 1960s, it was long thought to be a fake because it was too perfect. It wasn't until 2018, just a few years ago, that modern science confirmed it is authentic. It is the oldest book in the Americas, a fragment of a Venus almanac that waited in the dark for 800 years. These 4 books are the Dead Sea Scrolls of the Americas. They are the only voice left of a civilization that was silenced by fire. When the fire in Mani died down, a terrible silence descended on the Yucatan. Burning the books was a tragedy, but Diego de Landa did something far more permanent. He dismantled the educational system. The knowledge of how to read the complex Mayan glyphs was restricted to a small elite class of nobles and priests. During the Inquisition, these were the exact men Landa targeted. They were tortured, discredited, or killed. The survivors were forced to abandon their devil script and learn the Latin alphabet. Within just 3 generations, the ability to read Mayan hieroglyphs, a writing system that had been used for 2,000 years, vanished from the face of the earth. The great stone cities of Tikal, Palenque, and Chichen Itza were swallowed by the jungle. When European explorers stumbled upon them centuries later, they saw the carvings on the walls, but they were mute. They saw kings sitting on thrones, they saw captives being beheaded, and they saw rows of complex dates. But to the Victorian explorers, these weren't history. They were just decoration, doodles. Because the books were gone, scholars convinced themselves that the Maya were a peaceful, simple people who only cared about calendars and corn. They couldn't read the wars, the betrayals, and the poetry carved right in front of their eyes. But here is the final, twisting irony of Diego de Landa. The man who destroyed the language is also the only reason we can read it today. In his later years, perhaps feeling a strange mix of guilt and scholarly curiosity, Landa wrote a book called Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán. In it, he tried to document the culture he had crushed. He included a sketchy section known as Landa's alphabet. He sat down with one of the last surviving Mayan scribes and asked him, "How do you write the letter A?" The scribe, confused, drew the glyph for a turtle head, pronounced A. Landa asked, "How do you write B?" The scribe drew a footprint, pronounced B. Landa thought he was creating an alphabet. He wasn't. The Maya didn't have an alphabet. They had a syllabary, sounds. For 400 years, linguists looked at Landa's notes and said, "This is gibberish, it doesn't work." They threw his book aside, thinking the old friar was crazy. It wasn't until the 1950s that a Russian linguist named Yuri Knorozov realized the truth. Landa and a scribe were having a miscommunication. The friar was asking for letters, The scribe was giving him sounds. This realization unlocked everything. The man who burned the library had accidentally left the key to the front door under the mat. While Western archaeologists were hacking through the jungles of Mexico, the key to the code was thousands of miles away, buried in the rubble of World War II. In May 1945, the Red Army was storming Berlin. In the chaos of the burning city, a young Soviet artillery spotter named Yuri Knorozov stumbled into the ruins of the Prussian State Library. The building was engulfed in flames. Soldiers were looting gold and wine, but Knorozov didn't take trophies. He saw a book lying in the ash, a rare black-and-white reproduction of the Mayan surviving codices. He picked it up, put it in his rucksack, and carried it back to Moscow. Knorozov was a ghost. He worked in a tiny, cramped office in Leningrad, completely cut off from the West by the Iron Curtain. He had never seen a Mayan ruin. He had never stepped foot in the jungle. But he had one advantage. He wasn't poisoned by the arrogant theories of Western scholars. The leading American expert, Sir Eric Thompson, insisted that Mayan glyphs were purely mystical ideograms, pictures of ideas, not sounds. He ruled the field like a dictator, destroying the career of anyone who disagreed. Knorozov looked at the data with fresh eyes. He looked at Landa's alphabet again. He realized that when Landa asked for B, the Mayan scribe didn't draw the letter B. He drew the sound be, which means road in Mayan. Knorozov realized the glyphs were syllables, not letters. Ka, ba, la. Alone in his cold office, often with only his beloved Siamese cat Asya for company, Knorozov began to read the unreadable. He proved that the Maya didn't just draw pictures, they wrote sentences. They had grammar, they had poetry. When he published his findings in 1952, the West laughed at him. They called it communist propaganda. It would take another 30 years for the world to admit that the Russian ghost was right. For decades, even as the code was slowly being cracked, scholars held on to a comforting fantasy. They believed the Maya were unique in human history. They looked at the ruins in the jungle and decided that this was a civilization without war. The prevailing theory was that the Maya were a race of philosopher priests who spent their days contemplating time and worshiping the corn. They believed the figures carved on the stones were gods and the dates were purely astronomical cycles. Enter Tatiana Proskuryakov. She wasn't a linguist, she was an architect. In the 1960s, while sketching the ruined monuments of Piedras Negras, she noticed something peculiar about the dates carved on the stone stele. She wasn't reading the words, she was looking at the intervals. She saw a pattern, a date. Then, about 12 to 30 years later, another date. Then, a series of dates stretching for about 60 years. Then the pattern stopped, and a new one began. Proskuryakov realized this wasn't the movement of stars. Stars don't have 60-year cycles that stop abruptly. This was the length of a human life. She proposed a radical idea. The first date was a birth. The second was an accession to the throne. The final date was a death. Suddenly, the gods on the stones stopped being mythological beings. They became kings. When we applied Knorozov's phonetic readings to Proskuryakov's historical timeline, the peaceful Maya illusion evaporated instantly. The texts didn't say, "the god planted the corn." They said, "In the year 744, King Shield Jaguar captured Lord Jewel Skull and sacrificed him." The Star War glyph was identified, a verb that literally meant to chop or to axe. We realized the jungle wasn't a garden of philosophy, it was a battlefield of superpowers. Tikal and Calakmul were locked in a centuries-long Cold War that frequently turned hot. They were superpowers like the US and Soviet Union, fighting proxy wars, arranging political marriages, and wiping entire cities off the map. Because of the burning of the books, we had missed the drama for 400 years. We thought they were looking at heaven, but they were looking at each other's throats. While Diego de Landa was burning books in the 1560s, a piece of the Maya civilization was still alive. Deep in the Petén jungle of Guatemala, surrounded by a massive lake, lay the island city of Tayasal, Noh Petén. It was the last Mayan kingdom. For nearly 200 years after Columbus arrived, Tayasal remained unconquered. While Mexico City was building cathedrals and universities, the priests on this island were still tracking Venus, still worshiping the old gods, and, crucially, still writing books. Tayasal was a time capsule. It was a fortress of knowledge protected by water and thick jungle. Spanish missionaries who visited the island in the early 1600s described seeing great houses filled with idols and books. They reported that the Itza priests were frantically copying their old codices, trying to preserve their history before the end of the world arrived. They knew the bearded men were coming. The Itza believed in cyclical time. Their calendars predicted a cycle of destruction. A Katun 8 Ahau would arrive in the year 1697. They didn't fight the prophecy, they prepared for it. The prophecy was self-fulfilling. In March 1697, exactly on the predicted date, a Spanish conquistador named Martín de Ursúa attacked the island with a galley ship armed with cannons and arquebuses. The battle was short. The Itza warriors, armed with bows and obsidian swords, were no match for the gunpowder. When the Spanish stormed the city, they didn't just kill the warriors, they went for the libraries. Ursúa reported finding so many books that he used them to build a ramp for his horses to walk up the slippery limestone steps of the temple. Think about that image. The last written history of the Americas wasn't just burned, it was trampled into the mud by the hooves of a conqueror's horse. The last light of the Maya went out, not with a bang, but with the snap of a spine under an iron shoe. When we look up at the planet Venus, we see the goddess of love, a bright, beautiful morning star. But when the Maya looked at Venus, they didn't see love. They saw a threat. They called it Chak-Ek, the great star. But in the codices that escaped the fire, it is depicted as a warrior spearing a victim. To the Maya, the movement of Venus was the heartbeat of war. The surviving Dresden Codex contains something that shouldn't exist in the ancient world, a perfect mathematical model of the planet's orbit. The Maya calculated that the synodic period of Venus, the time it takes to return to the same spot in the sky, is 584.5 days. But here is the problem. The actual astronomical length is 583.92 days. That tiny difference, 0.08 of a day, doesn't seem like much. But over hundreds of years, that error adds up. The calendar would drift. The predictions would fail. So, the Maya priests created a correction formula. They created an algorithm. The Dresden Codex outlines a correction over a span of 104 years. They knew exactly when to drop days to keep the calendar perfectly synced with the physical universe. Let's look at the numbers to understand the madness of what Diego de Landa burned. A modern telescope calculates the Venus cycle at 583.920 days. The ancient Maya calculated it at 583.920 days. They achieved 100% precision without glass lenses, without metal sextants, and without decimal points. They did it purely through centuries of observation and bark paper records. This wasn't just abstract science, it was military intelligence. The kings of Tikal and Kalakmu used these tables to plan their attacks. They waited for the heliacal rising of Venus when it first appears in the dawn sky after being hidden by the sun. This was the danger moment. The moment the wasp star appeared, armies marched. When Landa burned the library, he didn't just burn superstition. He burned the most advanced astronomical dataset humanity had ever produced. He burned the proof that the indigenous people of the Americas had surpassed the science of Europe, while Europe was still using leeches to cure a headache. In the early 21st century, the world went mad. Hollywood movies, survivalist bunkers, and internet forums were obsessed with a single date: December 21, 2012. Millions of people believed the Maya had predicted the end of the world. Why? Because a stone carving known as Tortuguero Monument 6 seemed to say that the calendar would simply stop. This panic was the direct result of Diego de Landa's fire. Imagine finding a car's odometer in a junkyard, but you have no manual on how to read it. You see the numbers rolling up, 99999. You might assume that when it hits the limit, the car explodes. But if you had the manual, you would know the truth. It just rolls back to zero. The Maya didn't view time as a straight line leading to a cliff. They viewed it as a circle, a cycle. The long count calendar was a massive machine of cogwheels. It counted days in groups called baktuns, 144,000 days. The cycle that began in 3114 BC was scheduled to end after 13 baktuns, exactly on December 21, 2012. Because Landa burned the books that explained the rituals, we filled the silence with our own fears. We projected our modern anxieties onto their ancient math. Scholars who analyzed the few surviving fragments found that the date 2012 wasn't marked by fire and brimstone. It was marked by a feast. The glyphs speak of the descent of a mysterious entity named Bolon Yokte, the nine-footed god. He wasn't coming to destroy the earth. He was coming to oversee the changing of the guard. It was a cosmic New Year's Eve party. The Maya weren't preparing to die. They were preparing to recarpet the temples and paint the walls red. The loss of the books also birthed the strangest theory of all: the ancient astronauts. Without the written texts to explain their metaphors, people looked at the sarcophagus lid of King Pakal in Palenque and saw a man flying a spaceship. They saw buttons, oxygen tubes, and rocket flames. But once the code was cracked, we could read the instruction manual carved on the sides of the tomb. It wasn't a rocket, it was the world tree. Pakal wasn't flying into space, he was falling into the underworld, Xibalba, descending down the roots of the sacred ceiba tree to be reborn as the maize god. The flames were the jaws of the earth monster. Because Landa burned the library, we forgot the poetry of their religion. We replaced a beautiful spiritual metaphor with a sci-fi cartoon. The verdict. So did the Maya predict the end of the world? In a way, yes. But they got the date wrong. The apocalypse didn't come in 2012. It came in 1562 in the Plaza of Mani. That was the day their universe truly collapsed. The year 2012 was just a ghost story we told ourselves because we were afraid of the silence they left behind. Diego de Landa did a thorough job. He burned the bark, he smashed the idols, and he silenced the priests. But he made one mistake. He forgot that the Maya didn't just write on paper. They wrote on stone. And deep in the Chiapas jungle, hidden by centuries of overgrowth, there was one library he couldn't find. In 1946, an American filmmaker named Giles Healy was wandering through the rainforest, guided by the Lacandan Maya, the descendants of the few who fled the Spanish conquest. They took him to a place called Bonampak. It didn't look like much, just a small limestone building swallowed by vines. But when Healy ducked his head and entered the dark, bat-filled chambers, he turned on his flashlight and screamed. The walls were staring back at him. He had found the Sistine Chapel of the Americas. For the first time, we weren't looking at eroded stone or black and white drawings. We were looking at a movie frozen in time. The walls were covered in murals from floor to ceiling, and they were terrifying. Up until this moment, scholars still clung to the idea of the peaceful Maya. Bonampak killed that myth instantly. The murals depict a brutal raid. We see warriors in jaguar skins dragging captives by their hair. We see prisoners with their fingernails torn out, bleeding from their fingers. We see a decapitated head rolling down the stairs. It was a scene of absolute carnage, painted with the delicacy of a Renaissance master. The Maya weren't just astronomers, they were imperialists who celebrated pain. But the real scientific mystery wasn't the violence, it was the color. The murals were 1,200 years old. They had been exposed to the 100% humidity of the jungle, the rain and the mold. By all laws of chemistry, the paint should have peeled off centuries ago. But the blue background was as bright as a neon sign. Scientists spent decades trying to reverse engineer this pigment, known as Maya blue. It turns out the Maya were using nanotechnology. They figured out how to fuse indigo dye from a plant inside the microscopic lattice of a rare clay called palygorskite. This trapped the color molecules in a crystal cage, making them immune to acid, time, and sunlight. Landa could burn the books, but he couldn't destroy the chemistry. The walls of Bonampak stood as a vibrant, bloody middle finger to the erasure of history. Diego de Landa destroyed the libraries, smashed the altars, and burned the idols. But there was one holy place he couldn't touch. Just north of the Great Pyramid of Chichen Itza lies a gaping hole in the earth, the Cenote Sagrado, the sacred cenote. It is a natural sinkhole, 200 feet wide and 90 feet deep, filled with murky green water. Landa stood on the edge of this pit in 1562. In his book, he wrote a chilling sentence. "Into this well they have had the custom of throwing men alive as a sacrifice to the gods in times of drought. They also threw into it a great many other things, like precious stones and things which they prized." Landa looked down, but he couldn't reach the bottom. For 300 years, the jungle grew over the rim, and the well became a legend. In 1904, an eccentric American diplomat named Edward Herbert Thompson bought the land. He didn't come to farm, he came to fish. But he wasn't fishing for tuna. He imported a massive steam-powered dredging machine from the United States, set it up on the edge of the cliff, and dropped a steel bucket into the dark water. For weeks, he pulled up nothing but mud, tree branches, and dead iguanas. Then, one day, the bucket came up with something shining. It wasn't a rock. It was a nodule of pure incense resin, copal. Then came the gold. He pulled up gold bells, gold masks, copper rings, and jade axes. He had found the bank vault of the Maya. Because these items were underwater, they were perfectly preserved. The fire of the Inquisition couldn't reach them. But he also found what Landa predicted: bones. This discovery birthed one of the most persistent myths in history, the sacrificial virgin. Victorian society loved the idea of beautiful young women being thrown into the well to please the rain god. It was a romantic, tragic image. But modern forensic science has shattered that fantasy. When bioarchaeologists analyzed the skulls found in the well, they found a very different reality. The gender. The majority of the victims were not women. They were children, mostly boys, and adult male warriors. The origin. Isotope analysis of their teeth revealed that many of them weren't local. They were pilgrims who had traveled hundreds of miles to die here. The trauma. Many showed signs of previous torture or illness. This wasn't a beauty pageant. It was a desperate, bloody plea for rain during a climate collapse. We now understand that the cenote wasn't a trash can. It was a post office. The Maya believed the rain god, Chak, lived at the bottom of the sinkhole. When the rains failed and the corn died, you didn't just pray, you sent a messenger. You took a child or a captive warrior and you weighed them down with the most precious gold you owned. You threw them in not to punish them, but to deliver a message directly to the landlord of the universe. Landa called it devil worship. But looking at the isotope data, we see a civilization terrified of starvation, throwing their wealth and their future into the dark water, hoping for one drop of rain. Diego de Landa believed he could burn a culture out of existence. He believed that if he destroyed the books, the Maya would forget who they were. For 500 years, it looked like he was right. The Maya people survived, but they lived in a world of amnesia. They walked past the great pyramids of their ancestors and saw only piles of stone. They were told by colonial governments that they were simple peasants, people without history, people without science. But Landa failed. He failed because he underestimated the resilience of the human mind, and he failed because he didn't count on the future. Today, in the highlands of Guatemala and the schools of the Yucatan, a revolution is happening. It is not fought with guns, it is fought with dry erase markers. For the first time in 5 centuries, the Maya people are reading their own history. A new generation of Mayan epigraphers has emerged. These aren't European professors in tweed jackets, they are indigenous teenagers in jeans and t-shirts. They are attending workshops where they learn the grammar of their ancestors. Imagine the moment a young Maya student looks at a stela that has been silent for a millennium and reads the words aloud. Here sits Bird Jaguar IV, Lord of the Mutal Kingdom. It is a psychological earthquake. Suddenly they are not peasants. They are the descendants of a literacy that rivals Rome. The spell of the Spanish conquest is broken. This revival is being accelerated by the very technology that Landa could never have imagined. The internet has become the new library of the Maya. Young artists are creating new digital fonts for Mayan glyphs. They are coding apps that translate Spanish into hieroglyphs. They are rapping in Quiche and Yucatec on TikTok. We are even seeing the return of the codex. Contemporary Maya artists are painting new folding books on bark paper, recording modern events, the civil wars, the COVID pandemic, the struggle for land rights, using the ancient script. The first hard drive of the Americas has been rebooted. There is a profound irony in Mani today. If you go to the town where the books were burned, you will still see the old church that Landa built. But just down the street, you will hear children speaking the language he tried to strangle. The fire destroyed the paper, but it hardened the resolve. By trying to erase them, Landa accidentally turned the script into a symbol of resistance. Every time a modern Maya child tattoos a glyph on their arm or writes a poem in hieroglyphs, they are winning a war that started in 1562. In the end, we return to the fire. Looking back at July 1562, it is easy to despair. The burning of the Mayan library was one of the greatest crimes in history. It was a lobotomy of the human species. Because of Diego de Landa, there are huge gaps in our understanding of the ancient world that will never be filled. We will never know their songs, their plays, or the names of the philosophers who invented the concept of zero. That smoke took things from us that we didn't even know we had. But history has a strange sense of justice. Diego de Landa wanted to be remembered as a saint, the man who saved the Yucatan from the devil. Instead, he is remembered only as the villain in the story of the people he hated. His grave in Spain is quiet, but the ruins of the people he tried to erase are visited by millions of people every year. The pyramids of Tikal and Chichen Itza stand as mountains of defiance. They prove that you can burn paper, but you cannot burn geometry. You cannot burn the math that aligns a stone temple with the sunrise. This story is not just about the past, it is a warning for the present. The Maya stored their knowledge on bark and stone. Ours store on silicon and servers. In a way, their hard drives were more durable than ours. If the power goes out tomorrow, our digital library vanishes. If a fire sweeps through a server farm, our cloud evaporates. But the Mayan stones are still reading the time. The Dresden Codex, battered and water-damaged, still predicts the orbit of Venus with perfect accuracy. The survival of those 4 books teaches us a powerful lesson. Knowledge is stubborn. It wants to live. It hides in caves. It disguises itself as souvenirs, and it waits for centuries for someone to crack the code. When we look up at the night sky tonight, we see the same stars the Maya saw. They realized before anyone else that we are part of a massive clockwork machine. They tried to write down the user manual for the universe, and for a moment we burned it. But the smoke has cleared, the code has been broken, and after 500 years of silence, the library is open again.